Okay, Zoocracy. Let's talk a little bit about this. Um, well, to begin with, it didn't meet my hopes, which don't really matter too much probably, because they're not what the designer was designing for. But when I look at, when I take on a game for a Kickstarter, especially for a preview or something, or a review game, I usually don't put a lot of effort into figuring out, do I really want, is this something I really want to play? Because, I don't know, I don't put all that much effort in sometimes with things I buy either. And I figure people are kind of looking and they say, this might be something you would like. We're trying to play into his wheelhouse. And in some ways, I can see why, because, I do ask for, hey, wow, there is no good parliamentary election game out there. Unfortunately for this one, it doesn't suit my needs because it doesn't feel like it's grounded in any kind of reality. Even the reality of, say an Animal Farm type situation, or, the world of the zoo, it just feels like I'm looking at something that maybe has too simplistic a view of what a population is swayed by. They're not swayed by simple bribes. You don't go out outside of some very ancient democracies and republics. If you look at Rome, yeah, handing money out pretty much bought you elections. There might be some limits to how much you could just buy an election, but largely, yeah, you could pretty much just fund yourself an election. What we've seen is that huge outlays of money, in a more modern system, don't tend to manage that. And my feeling was that this is meant to represent more modern types of parliamentary democracies. However, by handling that, hey, we're having an overall across the government parliamentary election in sync with a head of state president who has some kind of powers as well. All of that's very appealing. The problem is, the way that you gain votes, the way that you keep votes, the only loyalty you have among your voters is based on, hey, did I get lucky with a card? And if you did, it's not that big a deal, right? It's a couple of votes somewhere. And you have to be in the lead at the end of the parliamentary election. You have to win the parliamentary election in that particular animal in order to keep your votes there. So there's no concept of like rewarding your voters with agenda items that they care about. No, your agenda items are simply this very abstracted, meaningless thing that is just your victory points in the game. So what you end up getting is deals that are being cut that have nothing but the deal cutting itself. What works into it is, oh no, this person's about ready to win, and that's the only facet that's in play. So that's very disturbing to me. There was another facet that I noticed that kind of disturbed me was the way that the acceleration of snap elections came up. That, again, I feel like the Prime Minister should be making that decision, and there should be costs to that decision or benefits to that decision that they get to weigh, not, I got a card that lets me do it. No matter who I am, I can just play this and cause an election to happen in either the presidential or in the parliamentary election and jump it ahead of time. Okay. So in those ways, it doesn't feel like it really models anything that I'd like to see in that parliamentary election. And it ends up being, too disconnected, the electorate too disconnected from what they're voting for, uh, the decision making not really connected to a parliamentary system particularly. It all just becomes a model for a Euro game, essentially. So that's kind of disturbing to me, but that may not matter to you. So what about the play of the game? Well, one thing that was brought up by a viewer was, hey, who is this meant to appeal to? Exactly, because it seems a little weird. The artwork, which my wife fell in love with, she's an artist type person, and that others really liked. Very, very pretty. And yeah, here I am going to the components, right? But I think that's one of the key elements of this, is this kind of cartoony artwork of the animals and making them seem, kind of like people too, anthropomorphizing them with, this kind of cutesy approach to it that I can see being very appealing to different kinds of people. But then within that, a game that is about cutting deals, and that kind of doesn't seem to mesh as well. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I see that distinction so much. Like, I'm okay with the imagery and the idea of a government with that imagery. That doesn't really bother me. But I know it kind of got on a kind of nod at, well, who are they aiming at? My answer to that was kind of flip, as everything is for me, except for my damn chainsaw that won't start and that I don't know how to use, which is maybe it's intended to teach little children about the basics of parliamentary systems. But I don't think so. It's not a kid's game in any sense of the word. I don't think kids would do well in it. I mean, I'm sure some could play it, but I get the feeling that the kind of decisions that you're making and the kind of negotiations that you'd involve in, sometimes kids are a little too easily swayed by things outside of, say, how somebody's path to victory is there and how you can stop them. Now, some kids may be better than others. I'm not sure that I was particularly good at, say 8 or 9, at that kind of thinking. I would be like, well, how can I pad my own points? That's all I'm worried about, right? So let me take a look at, this because that's the easiest for me. Yeah, I'm an old man. So the order of play, by staggering the presidential and parliamentary elections, means that you have sort of this. You have this ever-changing sort of circumstances as to where you want to spend your money. On the presidential elections, you can get a quick victory point off of winning that bid, and that can be a lot cheaper than trying to get a victory point out of the parliamentary elections. Again, the game changes by the number of players. So I'm looking at the 6-player game where the presidential election, a bid of $15 could easily get you a victory point, right? In most circumstances. But $15 in a parliamentary election is maybe able, that you spend over the time, may or may not, depending on how many seats you had in the prior parliament, because the less seats you had in the prior parliament, well, the further back in the chamber that you are in the vote totals in the prior parliament, the more power you have to really grab seats in the next parliament. Well, which again, that to me makes no sense, right? But there is a mitigating factor to that, which we'll get to in a moment. But the fact of the matter is, those bucks played by the person who's in the lead in the current parliament may be better spent on the presidential election, just in terms of how many victory points can you get for the money that you're spending. However, there is a twist to this, which is that all you get out of the presidential election, for the most part, you get an office which might give you some bonuses that you don't know about, or that you have a card that is sitting in your hand that you do know about. But all you really get is pretty much that one victory point. Whereas in the parliamentary election, if you win that and are able to form a government, be involved in a formed government, you probably can manage early in the game at least to get yourself a victory point out of that, which puts it at about even. And however many seats you total in the election, you're going to get that in cash back. And that means you're ready for the next parliamentary election. So getting a hoard of cash off the parliamentary elections may be even more valuable than getting the victory points. Because the victory points are obvious to everyone to see, and they can see, hey, so-and-so's in the lead. I'm not sure, I think we're more willing to form a kind of government that'll help someone who's further back. There are also advantages to not being in the government, though, which are that you get more of these action cards, which means you have more opportunities to kind of tweak the elections a little bit, and also potentially even to steal yourself a victory point. You might be able to, even though you're in the lead, swing an office that you're interested in because you can grab a victory point for that office in exchange for giving people kind of guaranteed victory points off of, hey, you can be prime minister and we'll assign the points to these 3 people, but I want this office. One of the things that's kind of interesting about it is, less so to me maybe than to some other people, is this idea of you can make promises in this game having to do primarily, you can make any promises you like, but primarily about implementing the political goal, which is, hey, I'll give you a victory point. If I'm prime minister, I commit to giving you a victory point. And you actually make that commitment part of your platform, but then you can renege on that. You can't really renege on handing out offices, because that's part of the platform that you're declaring. You declare which offices, and you declare who's going to get the political goal implemented. What's kind of weird is the guy who offers the coalition is not necessarily going to have the choice of whether or not it gets implemented the way that they set it up. The prime minister gets to decide that, which is a little interesting. There's a fair amount of randomness in these cards. Some of them are clearly appear to me to be better than others. Some of them are very obviously, something that just gives you a victory point. It won't do it automatically, but if you get a certain office, you can probably engineer that office, even if it's just by being quiet about which office you have. You could say, I don't care which one. Or you could be like, oh, I want the rhino because he looks really nasty. There are no rhinos in the game except for the office. There's no lions either. That's interesting. I think actually all of the offices, there's no animal constituency which meets them. Okay. So you can kind of play on psychology that way to try to see if you can get something by either, seeming interested in something, but then nobody just knows, or you could be like, oh, let's just roll a die for which one I get, or whatever, and maybe you'll get stuck with one that you want, especially since if you're holding the card for that one, well, nobody else is holding the card that gives a victory point for that one, so that's kind of cool too. I found the iconography as often particularly difficult, and let's go to some of the cards. Notably, now I would obviously find it easier to have it language dependent, but there are reasons not to do that. But basically, you have something like this. Now you have a little lookup sheet that you can find on it, and that's fine. But the hard part is with your action cards, This little timer space up here, I found that particularly hard to see in all the color and beauty of the imagery. I'm not sure what can be done about that, you know. Words would be hidden on it too, so it's not like that would be particularly helpful. These may be a little too small for someone my age's eyes, but, you know, whatever. If we're using a magnifying glass or my reading glasses, I can kind of see it. But it is very, very fine print. Of course, it's small enough that you can bring it to your face kind of closely. It's kind of amazing to me, the idea that, like, this is just a preview copy. This isn't, I've seen others, like when I did 1918, boy, was that a good solid copy. But, you know, the cards are still better quality than games used to have back in my day, except for, like, if it was Milton Bradley or Parker Brothers. And they're about that quality. They're not quite the high quality that some, you know, finished product, probably the finished product for this game would have. The only weak spot, really, is the board itself, which I'm sure will be better. It's just, you know, kind of a pasteboard thing, which is nice. Oh, something I had to go into. So, yeah, the rules are going through another revision. I didn't find them terribly difficult. It's not a very long set of rules. I had some difficulty grasping some concepts until I saw them in action. There are some things that kind of maybe you have to play around with a bit and then maybe comb through the rules and find stuff like why ties weren't allowed. Well, it starts to become obvious, and then it starts to stick in your head a little bit better. I don't know what the standees are for. Don't go back. But one thing, yeah, the one thing that I did want to talk about was apparently the Kickstarter was canceled, but that doesn't mean the game's not going to be published. I'm not sure what the status is, but it looks like the intention for this one is to relaunch the Kickstarter, because it looked like it was just going to fail on its goal, on meeting its goals, and try to get a little bit more buzz or whatever before it gets started. I don't know what that means. I don't know, you know, how that affects people at all. Some people seemed upset about it. I'm not quite sure why. I try to avoid Kickstarters, so you can see that that's an issue. Yeah, it's you know, it's a playable, shorter Euro-ish type game where you have this capacity to play in an election type situation with multiple players. You have a little bit of room for backstabbing. Honestly, I feel like there may be too little impetus for keeping your word. It almost feels like whatever you declare your political agenda is going to be this, you know, the sequence of 3 political agendas that you can deal out when you get to form a government. That's just going to end up pretty much getting thrown out in most cases for situational reasons. And especially as you get later in the game, hey, you've got an extra victory point over everyone else. You are not going to get what we promised you no matter what. And almost everybody will agree with you. Will you make an enemy? Well, you know, if you can make a pretty good argument why no, you don't deserve yet another victory point, usually people don't get too pissed about that. People get pissed when there's an agreement and they feel like it's, you know, kind of ironclad and everything, and then you kind of stab them, especially for no reason, especially if you're not gaining anything. But if, you know, it's quite possible that somebody can just take the prime minister and say, yes, I'm going to help you, and then they just stab you and grab another victory point. I think if somebody does that early in the game, they're probably going to pay a price for that. But that price may end up getting wiped out if the price is high enough that they lag behind in the game, and then they might start obtaining obtaining extra agenda items given to them simply because they're in the worst shape. We saw towards the end of the game where it was like, well, let's see how we can get this in the hands of someone who just can't win, and then even if they get all three of them, well, at best that puts them close to the leaders of the pack. Now, I think if you're playing in like 4 people, you're going to start seeing a lot more possibility of like coalitions of just 2 people, or even the possibility of one person being able to dominate the government all by themselves, which would be an ugly situation. If somebody can get the dominance of the government all by themselves, then barring playing a card which calls for an early parliamentary election, they're going to be able to hand themselves 3 victory points that way. The play of the game is going to be different depending on the number of players. In the 6-player game, I think it's very unlikely that you'll have somebody reach an automatic victory, but the less players, the more likely. One thing I wanted to look at, I don't even know if I went into these, was the 2- and 3-player games. Yeah, I kind of did. So what's kind of weird here is usually no coalitions are farmed. The majority marker is not used. Instead of a coalition proposal, the party that has the most seat takes all 3 political office cards. All other parties are in opposition. In 2 players, yes. And I think the 2-player game would be particularly uninteresting. But in 3 players, I would say leave that negotiation in place. If somebody is able to get the majority of votes, great. But otherwise, play the game out by the base rules. I'm not sure, how that would work, but I think the 2-player game looks absolutely uninteresting, and I wouldn't suggest that at all. And that's why I didn't play it with my wife. The 3-player game might be slightly interesting. I've seen, 3-player political alignment type games like this that work well enough. But I think you're really looking at a game that you want 4 to 6 players for, so that you can get that wheeling and dealing in. And maybe the optimal is 4, simply because at 6, you're starting to look at, you need 3 people to vote the government. The 3rd guy probably is not going to get an agenda item, stuff like that. That just starts to make it problematic. But for me, there wasn't really enough here outside of a mechanism that doesn't seem to represent parliamentary elections strongly enough. I'm not saying it doesn't kind of catch some of the mechanisms, but it doesn't go into, it doesn't correctly represent, say, how voters are retained and how parties are built up, how you keep the loyalty of your party members just by giving them money, that seems very, very false to me. And some of the other aspects. And then also, some of the stuff that would go with that is there's nothing else to go with this. So you could have a very simple election system like this, like you do in Junta, but you have it driving another game as well. One of the things that I found kind of interesting was no trade of cards, no trade of money, nothing like that. I'm used to these kind of wheeling dealing games to have some ability to transfer money. That helps you with, hey, I want that victory point still, and I know you're really tempted to just steal it from me, but how about I give you $3 for you to keep your word at this point? But there's nothing like that in here. It's actually disallowed by the rules, which I kind of feel like you're more likely to see people just kind of say, well, I promised you this, but the hell with that. We know that this game promises just don't count at all, even more than they don't count in a game of diplomacy. It may just come to the point where, like, whoever gets to be prime minister is just sitting there doling themselves victory points. That may depend upon the group. Obviously, some group, if the group kind of sees that as the norm, um, people are going to cut deals based on that and realize they're not going to get shit. If the group doesn't see that as the norm, you're going to see maybe some vendetta type behavior going on in it, which I like, but some people might not find particularly interesting. Anyway, let's look at this one. I don't know where, where it'll all end up, etc. Trying to think if I've seen a euro that is this, purely political in flavor. Obviously, Democker tries to be. I don't really remember it too well. And to me, in a sense, the more AT-ish things like Junta feel like such light treatments anyway, that and kind of silly treatments, that this feels kind of on that line, just more cut back. It's decided to do away with that military side, to do away with, there were some associations and cards with that. So anyway, it's a look at it overall. It's not something that I would particularly be all that excited about. I had my hopes, but it's just, it's not, it doesn't go deep enough into the concept of a parliamentary system, and it's just not well enough rooted into any kind of storyline for my tastes. So there you go.